So it's 7:05. We can get kicked off here. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the listening session for the Southampton MVP Planning Grant. Before I jump into the presentation, Ed, would you like to say a few words?
Oh, I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us this evening and, participating and finding out about the municipal vulnerability planning process that we are going through. The idea is to find ways to, shall we say, make the community of Southampton somewhat climate resilient, so that we take a look at the community itself, potential for natural disaster, which may come from climate change, and looking at ways to, shall we say, mitigate or lessen any risk for future potential disasters, catastrophes, or incidents. So we've had a few meetings. We have had 4 planning workshops, which were very helpful, and there were a lot of comments and ideas that came out of those that I definitely had not thought about. So it has been a good process, and I want to thank both Julie Busa and Sarah Hayden from ONeill for helping us through this process. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to you, Julia.
Great. Thank you, Ed. Before we get started, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Sarah Hayden, and I'm an environmental scientist with ONeill in the Water and Natural Resources Department. I have a background in environmental science as well as business administration and environmental economics. A lot of the work I do at ONeill focuses on MS4 or stormwater compliance. And I also do a lot of work with communities across the state on both MVP planning and action grants. Julie?
I'm Julie Busa. I'm a senior environmental scientist in the Water and Natural Resources group at ONeill. And I've worked with about 24 communities now on the MVP planning process, and probably another dozen or so working through action grants to help implement the priorities that were developed through this plan.
Everybody, so.
Thanks, Julie. So just a little bit about ONeill. We've worked, as Julie said, extensively with communities across the state on MVP, or Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program projects since its inception a few years ago. We've assisted with both planning and action grants. We're experienced in local government, environmental services, civil engineering, stormwater management, and emergency management. And to date, we've assisted communities in Massachusetts in securing more than $4.8 million in MVP action grant funding during the program's first 3 rounds. And we expect that amount to increase in the fall as the latest round of action grants are announced.
No, it's for everything, just like we went through in the workshops.
As a side note, Ed, I think you're not muted.
It started. Yeah, you're welcome.
Did you want to sit here?
That's okay, dear. Before you can.
All righty.
Fine.
So just a brief agenda of tonight's presentation. We're going to talk a little bit more about the MVP program. We're going to do a brief introduction to climate change and how it will and has impacted the community of Southampton. We're going to do a discussion on the summary of findings report, and then we're going to open it up for a public discussion and a little bit of Q&A.
Come on here.
I'm not gonna, I'll just listen.
Sorry, just as a reminder, would you mind muting yourselves if you're not speaking? There's a little button on the bottom right-hand corner. Thank you. So just a little bit more about Southampton's MVP grant. The planning grant supports climate change vulnerability assessments and resiliency planning. A vast majority of communities in Massachusetts have already gone through this planning grant process, which is a comprehensive approach in thinking about how climate change is and will impact a community in sort of 3 different sectors. which are infrastructure, society, and environment. The town of Southampton received $22,000 from the state to complete this process, which also included an open space and recreation plan update, which I believe is now completed, correct, Ed, by PVPC?
Yes.
Great. And so by doing this process, by conducting the MVP planning grant process, a community becomes what's known as an MVP certified community. And what this designation does is it leads to enhanced opportunities for future funding, so future grants. On many grant application, there's a box asking if a community is MVP certified, and Southampton can now check off that box and be eligible for various state grants. Okay. This also includes the MVP Action Grant funding, which supports priority actions identified in the Community Resilience Building Workshop during the MVP Planning Grant. There's $25,000 up to $2 million available for projects and $5 million available for regional projects. Statewide, there's up to $8 million available, and there's also a 25% match that is required, and that can be a cash match or an in-kind match. The latest grant round was due about a month ago, and the decisions are due in a couple months, and I believe the next action grant round is in spring 22, right, Julie?
Yes, that's correct.
Great. So on to the MVP planning grant process. We just want to give a thank you to those involved in the core team, which was really integral in kicking off this project and making for a successful planning grant process. And I apologize because I know many of you wear many hats within the town, but we just wanted to thank Ed Gibson, town administrator, Don Snyder from emergency management, John Workman from the fire department, Ian Illingsworth from the police department, Randall Kemp from the Highway Department, Brittany Goodermuth from the Conservation Commission, Caitlin Swistak-Brooks from the Board of Health, and Maureen Groden from the Select Board. We'd also like to thank the participants of the CRB workshop and also those of you that have come to the listening session tonight. Moving on to a brief discussion about climate change. So what do we mean when we use this term? We're thinking about the change in typical or usual climatic conditions, which is typically observed in 3 different ways. One is rising temperatures. The other is changing precipitation and changes in rainfall amount and intensity. And the other, which we hopefully won't see in Southampton for a very, very long time, is sea level rise. So when we're thinking about climate change in Southampton, we're going to be focusing on the first 2, which is changes in precipitation and changes in temperature. Okay, now just to give some context to these changes, we utilize data that was compiled through a state-led effort through the University of Massachusetts. Here we have a couple different categories. The first is related to temperature. This study established a baseline for this project, which was 1971 to 2000. So as you know, this baseline is already over 20 years old. So we're already actually starting to see some of the effects in the second column, which is projected changes into the 2030s. So for example, average annual temperature right now in Southampton is about 45 to 46 degrees, with up to about a 4.5 degree increase by the 2030s, some of which we're already starting to see. And by the end of the century, that's expected to be an increase of about 11 degrees on the upper end of the spectrum and about 4 degrees on the lower end of the spectrum. And this might be sort of hard to conceptualize, at least it is for me, this change in annual average temperature. So another way to think about it, which might be easier because we've all recently experienced it, is change in days over 90 degrees, which is close in our memories because just a few weeks ago and upcoming in this next week, we've experienced this. We know how brutal these temperatures can be. So at our baseline, we're at about 3 to 6 days of of temperatures over 90 degrees in Southampton. By the 2030s, this could be up to 20 days, give or take, on the higher end of the spectrum, and about 4 to 6 days on the lower end of the spectrum. And by the 2090s, it's going to be about up to 76 days more. So that's 2.5 months more of days over 90 degrees. And at the lower end of the spectrum, the prediction's about 9 more days of 90 degrees or over. So conversely with this, we're also going to see a drop in the days below freezing, or days below 32 degrees. Right now, we're at a baseline of about 160. And by the 2030s, that could be up to 28 less days. And by 2090s, that could be anywhere from 22 to 62 fewer days below freezing. So not only are we going to be seeing this increase in days above 90 degrees, but this is going to be coupled with fewer days below freezing. Moving on to precipitation, as a baseline in Southampton, we're at about 46 to 51 inches per year. By the 2030s, some of which we're already starting to see, this could be an increase of about 5 inches per year. And that might not seem like a lot, the 5 inches, but when you think about it, that's about a 12 to 15% increase from what we're seeing right now in total annual rainfall, which is quite a bit. And by the 2090s, this could be anywhere from 2 inches at the lower end of the prediction to up to 10 inches per year. This will also be coupled with an increase in dry periods. So while we are getting more annual rainfall, the way that we see that rainfall is going to shift. So we're going to have more periods of drought, and then that annual increase in rainfall that we see is going to come in more intense bursts of heavy precipitation. So dry days right now, we're seeing about 16 in Southampton, and that could be up to an additional 2 days by the 2030s. And then by the end of the century, that could be up to about 3 days more of annual consecutive dry days. And so keeping these effects of climate change in mind, the town went through what we call a community resilience building workshop, which is essentially thinking about how climate change and these effects that we just discussed are going to and have been impacting the town of Southampton. And so this resulted in what we call a summary of findings. And while we're going to briefly cover some of this content tonight, we can't go into a really deep dive because we covered a lot of great information at the workshops. We're going to briefly cover it and give you an overview of it today. Starting off, we asked the core team to identify the top 4 hazards relating to climate change in Southampton that have been seen or expected to be seen as a result of climate change. They were identified as heavy precipitation and flooding, drought and fire risk, extreme temperatures, both hot and cold, and extreme storm events and wind. So thinking about these top 4 hazards, the workshop teams were then asked to think about how these 4 hazards impact the 3 categories that we briefly mentioned before, which are infrastructure, society, and environment. And in terms of infrastructure, some of the topics that were brought up include roads. This is specifically related to roadway flooding that can result in heavy precipitation, and that can impact things like everyday commutes and also emergency access or evacuation routes. It can also be related to the shift in the freeze-thaw cycle that we're seeing in the past few years. So it requires more manpower and more resources to keep these roads safe. Also mentioned was culverts, bridges, and stormwater systems. The systems in Southampton, like in many communities across Massachusetts, were designed for historic precipitation. So that means they may not be able to handle, they might not have the capacity to handle the increases in precipitation that we're going to be seeing as a result of climate change, which may lead to issues of flooding and flooding of roadways and a whole slew of problems related to increases in precipitation. Electrical infrastructure was also a major concern, especially relating to especially relating to wind and heavy storms causing downed power lines. it was mentioned that due to its rural nature, Southampton might not be a top priority for power restoration. And so as a result, there are areas of town that may be without power for a few days. And there are also potential effects of power outages on emergency communications, which was a major concern. Septic systems and the subsequent impacts of septic system failure on the environment and human health were also mentioned, as was drinking water supply and the potential impacts of drought on these drinking water supplies. Buildings and facilities were also mentioned, specifically in terms of lacking cooling capacity or potentially backup power supplies. And finally, dams were mentioned as a topic of concern, as they may be prone to things like dam overtopping and dam failure, especially if they're in poor condition during heavy precipitation events. Moving on to environmental concerns, one topic that was mentioned was agriculture and gardens. There are numerous agricultural establishments in town, as well as personal private gardens, and these will be susceptible to not only the impacts of drought, but also the shifts in precipitation and temperatures that we're going to be seeing. So this could affect the viable species or cultivation potential of these properties. Trees and forests were also mentioned as a topic of concern, as their health can be impacted by a multitude of effects of climate change, including an increase in invasive species. One that was specifically mentioned at the workshop was the emerald ash borer, which can have devastating effects on the health of ash trees. Chemical and fertilizer use was also mentioned as a concern as it relates to both the environment and human health. It was also mentioned that it's difficult to regulate chemical and fertilizer use in town. The Barnes Aquifer was also mentioned, specifically relating to the impacts of drought on water availability and groundwater recharge rates. And finally, wetlands, riparian areas, and vernal pools. These all serve important environmental, ecological functions. And when it comes to climate change, they're great carbon sinks for carbon sequestration, but unfortunately, they are negatively impacted by the impacts of climate change. Moving on to the last category, which is society. First up is schools, the Norris Elementary School in particular, which is the school in town. It was mentioned that the school lacks air conditioning, and this is a concern for workshop participants, especially, as I mentioned, as we see this increase in days over 90 degrees. And the heat in the school was described as being unbearable, especially on the second floor of the school during these extremely hot days. It was also mentioned that the school actually had to shut down for a few days during this past heat wave because of the extreme temperature and the concern over the impact of the heat on students and faculty and staff and their well-being. There's also concern over seniors and vulnerable populations, especially as they may lack the necessary resources to adapt to the effects of climate change. For example, they might not have access to air conditioning in their homes, which is concerning as we continue to see temperatures rise. And especially as these populations may have existing health conditions that can make these extreme temperatures especially dangerous for them. And segueing off that, a lack of heating and cooling shelters was also mentioned as a topic of concern, as well as a lack of a designated emergency center in town, emergency shelter, excuse me. There is a shelter that the town can utilize in Northampton, but there's not one designated emergency shelter within Southampton. Stress on emergency services was also brought up as a concern. So as we see things like down power lines and roadway flooding becoming increasingly common, these can divert valuable resources and manpower and place additional stress on things like first responders and the highway department. Access to medical care and supplies was also brought up as a concern, especially during power outages, as well as open space and the impacts of climate change. like recreational areas. Staff capacity was mentioned as a concern, as well as the effects of the effects of climate change on the business community and its ability to adapt. Non-motorized travel was also brought up as something for the town. I'm sorry, if somebody's unmuted. I hear some rumblings, I'm sorry. Oh, and it stopped, okay. Pest and disease control are also becoming an increasing concern, especially as we've seen an uptick in things like Triple E and Zika virus. It's been all over the news in the past few years, and also an increase in things like Lyme disease, especially as we see these warmer winters where we don't have these freeze-offs. Finally, climate migration, or the idea that sea level rise will cause populations to sort of shift further inward to non-coastal communities like Southampton was mentioned as a concern, and potentially the idea that future development might place a burden on existing resources within the town.
Hey, Sarah, can I just jump in here for a minute? Who
Yes,
has control of the mute button? Could we mute Jay-Z? I think that's the one that's got their mic. Oh, somebody did it. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I don't think I have mute power. I think I can only screen share. But
it got muted, so hopefully that takes care of the issue.
Thank you. I couldn't see. Yeah, I'm looking at the slides. Thank you. Where is I? Okay. So it's important to know that even though on the past few slides and the past few minutes, I've focused on sort of the doom and gloom aspect of climate change and all these things that are going to happen, it's important to acknowledge steps that the town is already taking that can help to adapt to some of these effects and the sort of the strengths that the community has. And some of these were brought up at the workshop, and this is not an exhaustive list, but some of these include the open space and recreation plan update that has been completed by PVPC, the East Street bridge repairs that are planned, as well as upgrades to existing gas infrastructure that's at that location. It was mentioned that the town has robust community support, including from organizations such as religious organizations. The town's Council on Aging also provides numerous services for seniors. Southampton is currently part of a mosquito surveillance program. There are ongoing assessments of town-owned forests and their health. The town is also in the process of updating its master plan. The town also recently established an interconnection with the city of Easthampton's water supply, which is great if there's ever a water supply emergency. A stormwater bylaw is expected to pass at the next town meeting, which may have already occurred. I'm not sure. Ed, do you know? It did? I got a nod from Randall. Oh, Ed, you're still muted.
What was that question?
The stormwater bylaw, did it pass at the town meeting?
Yes, it did. So it's off to the Attorney General's office now.
Wonderful. I'll have to change that in the report. So the town just passed a stormwater bylaw. And the town also conducts wellness checks on seniors during significant weather events. That's an opt-in program. So workshop participants also identified several actions that can be taken to help mitigate some of the concerns that were brought up during the workshop, and to help keep Southampton prepared in the face of climate change. And these were done for each of the three different sectors: environment, infrastructure, and society. So a few of the high priority action items that were discussed for infrastructure and environment are to conduct a field inventory, assessment, and repair of culverts and bridges, sort of to ensure that they're able to handle this the future predicted precipitation changes that we're expected to see, conducting a townwide road assessment, assessing green infrastructure opportunities for stormwater management to help stormwater infiltrate and to address flooding concerns, conducting dam assessments and dam removal feasibility studies, coordinating with Eversource to manipulate the circuits and to sort of help isolate some of the power outages, exploring options for relocating the police dispatch repeater so it's more accessible, especially during inclement weather, evaluating options for a new public safety complex, assessing the feasibility of establishing a microgrid that's not connected to the existing electrical infrastructure, and evaluating the technology used for emergency communications. And for the society sector, some of the highest priority action items that were discussed were establishing secondary emergency access and evacuation routes, hiring a town planner, conservation, and code enforcement agent to increase staff capacity, assessing options for excessively hot days in school, and establishing designated heating and cooling shelters in town. A few of the moderate and lower priority action items, this is not an exhaustive list, but just a couple highlights, include assessing alternate energy options for the elementary school, establishing regulatory review for future developments to help reduce any potential future pressure on existing resources, supporting local businesses in the face of climate change, developing a town-wide climate action plan, conducting a risk assessment of vector-borne diseases, and also securing funding for the future years of the mosquito surveillance control program, conducting strategic planning to support the agricultural community in the face of climate change, conducting a survey of the vulnerability of town trails and bridges along waterways, conducting education and outreach on the importance of riparian corridors, developing a comprehensive forest management plan to protect forest health, conducting a risk assessment on private drinking wells, conducting a study on the impacts of climate migration on the town, conducting a risk assessment to identify vulnerable septic systems, developing a comprehensive invasive species management plan, and also establishing a formal town-wide drought plan. So with that, I'm sorry, I know I threw a lot of information at you, but please let me know if you have any questions, and we would like to open it up for any comments or discussion.
Hey, this is Brittany. I do have a question for you. In terms of the high priority things that are listed and then the lower moderate priority, will that impact what types of grants we can get from the state depending on what category those items fall into, or is this just trying to help us prioritize when we write the grants?
I'm going to segue that to Julie.
Sure. So in general, anything that is in the plan, and in particular, anything that's been categorized as high priority is sort of automatically eligible for MVP action grant funding. Now, that said, the action grants are looking for particular types of projects. So they're really focused on nature-based solutions, and they're looking for projects that are going to advance equity for environmentally and climate vulnerable populations and environmental justice communities. And projects that meet those criteria well are going to be much higher scoring. So I don't know, Sarah, if you want to flip back to the list of some of the priority projects.
Yeah, let me.
Perfect. So things like green infrastructure, that definitely falls under nature-based solutions. So that's a good fit. Some of the ones that are more about strictly assessments of existing quality of infrastructure, they're starting to move a little bit away from those. We're getting funded pretty readily in the couple of early rounds. But now that they've ramped up and the most of the communities in the Commonwealth are now part of the program, it's become a lot more competitive. So the focus is really sort of honing in on those key areas of nature-based solutions and equity. And so that has started to shift projects that are available. Microgrids and those kind of studies, they've recently changed their thinking on a little bit. And they're stating at this point that the planning aspects of those, they're not really funding through MVP because there's other programs that will fund them. So the priorities are tweaking a little bit, and we can certainly help you to think about which projects might be the best funded under the MVP program versus under other grants. When we're thinking about things like culverts and bridges, so with all of these, and I'm not sure if we said this at the beginning, but now that the community of Southampton is going to be MVP certified, you'll also get extra points on other state funding applications. So if there's a particular culvert that you think would score well through the Division of Ecological Restoration's culvert replacement grant, you'll get extra points towards that for being an MVP community. And that's one that focuses, it tends to benefit communities in our area because we're less developed and there tends to be more intact habitat around. And that's one of the things that the DER culvert grant is really looking for. They're focused on the ecological aspects in addition to flooding and infrastructure concerns around those culverts. So that can be a good opportunity. So some of these are going to be better fits for different programs, but that's anything that's listed as high priority is technically eligible for MVP funding.
Okay, so then with that said, I mean, and this is why I bring it up, is because we have a lot of conduct a study and assess, and should these be more like do this so we can get funded for it? Like, should we change the way that we're saying these things?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the other thing that MVP focuses on is they're looking for, they want to see sort of what your end game is, but they are looking for phased approaches. And they recognize, particularly because the MVP funding program is with a little bit of wiggle room, it's really a 10-month to a year time period that you have to complete a project. They know that you can't prioritize your culverts, design a culvert, and construct it all in one. So they're looking for phased projects. So I don't think that you're doing yourself a disservice by sort of starting with these early phases, which are what you need first. And we should also point out that the MVP plan, your priority list, is a living document. So this is not set in stone. And as things get checked off, you can update the priorities, you can add new things, you can specifically say, you know, now we've done some assessments and we know that the focus areas are culverts X, Y, and Z, and you can list those and call them out. And there's an opportunity through the annual reporting process, which is a pretty straightforward, just a couple page form, to tell them how you want to make those changes and what updates you're opting to make to your high priority projects.
Was the list of the top recommendations to improve resilience, is that based on likelihood of funding or, like for example, having a generator at Norris School didn't make the top, but it was in there, I think, to moderate. How was that decision made? And how do you see the evaluate options for new public safety complex is fitting in with what you just said about green solutions?
So Sarah may be able to speak a little bit better to how the information from the different groups that met over Zoom was collated and how they were prioritized into the different high, medium, and low categories. When we do the plan, we encourage you to come up with everything, whether we think all of the things that you think would help improve resiliency, whether we think they're highly fundable under this program or not. It's still good to be showing the state what the priorities are, where the needs are, even if they're not what the state is sort of gearing their funding towards in this moment. It also helps, I think, to sort of encourage the policymakers at the state level to understand the breadth of need as they're being asked to consider increasing funding for this program. So we encourage you to put everything in here and have it kind of all pulled together as everything that you think is important for improving your preparation for climate change. As far as the new public safety complex goes, one of the things, and I don't know, Sarah, if you have the report open, these are kind of truncated versions of how we describe the projects in the report. And with that sort of project, one of the things that we're looking for is not only the sort of social aspect of improving emergency response and making it easier for emergency response to get out to where they need to be during one of these hazards. But another aspect of that could be considering when that complex is constructed and built, can it be off-grid and self-sustaining through a microgrid? Can it incorporate green infrastructure? So there's definitely ways that you can tweak that project to make it fit better with those green solutions that they're looking for.
Yep, I just checked the report, and we do talk about making it in a central location that's easily accessible, especially during hazard events. And then we'll integrate elements of low impact design and also potentially alternate energy supplies. So tying in that green energy aspect of it.
So is the grant cycle only once a year?
It is. There was 1 year that they tried doing a second round, but I think they've settled into a pattern now where they're just going to do one per year, and it's each spring.
And just one other question. It looked like from the funding limits that there's some incentivizing regional projects.
Yes, that is definitely something that they've been pushing more and more, I would say. And I would say too, it's incentivized and they are looking for it. And partly that is based on the obvious conclusion that these sort of hazards don't follow municipal boundaries, right? The problems occur on a broader scale, and sometimes the solutions make more sense on a broader scale. But I would not say that by any means that the majority of funding is going to regional solutions, at least not at this stage. I would say most of the projects are still at the single community level.
And Maureen, to touch on the question of how they were ranked, so I took a look at the overlap between the two different sessions that we ran and what seemed to come out as major themes between those, and I sort of categorized those as higher priority and then moderate priority and lower priority. But also, if you feel like an action item should be moved up, please feel free to email me. I think Ed included my email address, but I can also put it in the chat box, and I'd be happy to bump some of those action items up to the higher priority category. Oops.
Well, I just can keep asking questions if nobody else has. So it says the in-kind amount for the funding. So let's say, going back to the same thing like the public safety complex or the generator. If FEMA or some other, either way, is the in-kind amount, I forgot, was it say 25% or match or something? Does that have to come from the municipality, or can it come from another source like FEMA, MEMA, something like that?
It can come from any non-state source. And because FEMA money gets channeled through MEMA, it's still federal, even though it gets channeled through MEMA, so that counts. So the FEMA BRIC program, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, is a great opportunity to make some of those match connections happen. The one trick with that is that lining up the grant cycles can be challenging, and that is an acknowledged issue and something that I think the state is trying to work around, but there haven't been any really great solutions to that just yet. But if you can line up the funding, you can definitely use federal sources or any other non-state source as the match for the program. Oh, Ed, I think you're muted. Yeah.
Julie, if you've got town employees working on a particular project, you can at least count at least partial of their salaries towards or hourly wages towards an in-kind match also, correct?
Yes, absolutely. It can be either cash or in-kind services. So any project, every project, you're going to have at least some level of town staff involvement, and you keep track of the hours that are being contributed, and all of that goes towards the project as well. And if you have, I know that a lot of town boards are supported by volunteers in Southampton. All of their time can be tallied as well, and there's a standard volunteer rate that gets used for that.
Oh, great. Thank you for letting us know that.
Mm-hmm.
This is Chris. I'm assuming part of the match could not come from Community Preservation Act. That's what you were just talking about?
Because
we do get allocations from the state for that match our taxes?
That is a good question, and I have not specifically asked about CPA funds. I could look into that for you. I know that some programs like Chapter 90, which is roads funding that comes from the state and is allocated, is not eligible, but I have not asked about CPA. So let me look into that. That's a good question.
And don't forget, there's a good portion of that CPC fund that comes from the local surcharge and the taxes rather than from the state. So they may look at it as two separate pools.
That's possible. Actually, you know what? I do know that I am working with another community that's planning to use CPA funding as part of their match. So I believe it does. I believe it is eligible. I'll confirm that though.
Mm-hmm. Do you mind just putting up the priority list again? Not necessarily the infrastructure ones, but the other page you have?
Absolutely. Is my text annotation going to stay? I'm so sorry. There's not a chat box for me to put it in. So I typed it on the screen and now I might not be able to get rid of it. That's okay. Okay. Yeah. Here's our society. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm, yep.
Okay,
so I think all of us would probably agree that hiring a town planner and a conservation agent and a code enforcement agent would be welcome. The question is, what kind of resources are there to pay for that? I mean, town budgets in a small town like Southampton cannot handle that. So I've not run across any kind of grant process where you could really be able to hire somebody even for just a year or 2 years to get things somewhat organized and established that could be done on a grant basis. Do you know of any particular ways that these people get funded, if you can find them?
That is a tricky one. And I have heard of some private foundation grants funding that sort of position, I believe, but none of off the top of my head, I don't believe there are any state or federal programs that would really be geared in that direction. Usually, sometimes they'll let you fund a short-term position, but anything that needs to be sustained over time usually gets tricky because all of these grants are tied to a short duration of money that has to be spent in a particular fiscal year. Yeah. That is probably one of the harder ones to fund because it is looking at a long-term need, but it's also, it's a really important need. And so I think it's important to have in the plan, even if it is sort of a pie in the sky. We're not sure how we could ever make this happen in realistic terms, but it's still good to recognize and be documented.
Yeah, well, it might be one where you go back to the idea of some sort of regionalization though.
Yeah, that is a good point.
Or you look for opportunities where you have a half-time employee that you bring up to full-time employee to cover those. But I think to build on what Juliana said, we need to prioritize stuff like this because we're falling behind on some of this stuff. I've heard the Conservation Commission for years say they need help. The Planning Board needs help. I mean, you could fold many positions into one individual and accomplish a lot of work. That would be positive work and help us long term. It's like you're spending money, but you're saving money in the long term by having some of this stuff taken care of. I think it's a good investment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Are there any other grant opportunities? So there's a few people that are on this call that are also part of an ad hoc grant committee, and we've kind of been logging and compiling lists of grant opportunities that might kind of incorporate some of these ideas into them already. Have you seen other communities using or applying for other grants to help supplement these projects with good success?
Yeah, so I mentioned the FEMA BRIC program, which was new. They actually haven't released the first round of awards yet. They're a little behind, but they're expected really any day. So that stands for Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. And there is a lot of money in that program. I should have the numbers off the top of my head. I don't want to misspeak, but I believe it's on the order of billions rather than millions, and that's nationally. But that's, that scale provides a lot more opportunity to make things happen in a lot of communities. So that's one that people are definitely keeping their eyes on and pretty excited about. And that's at the federal level again. So if you can make it work, that can also be a source of match. MVP, obviously. And then there are lots of sort of more niche programs that different projects might fit into. So I mentioned the DER culvert replacement grant. There's the small bridge program. There are some other funds available through FEMA, through different programs. What are some other good ones, Sarah?
Dam and Seawall Grant.
Yeah, the Dam and Seawall Grant has a number of different programs that can help both with repairs, but also with removal. DER also has a priority projects program that tends to look at either stream restoration or dam removals are kind of a couple of their big focuses. There are other programs that are focused more specifically on the energy side of things. And I'm sure I'm forgetting a number of them, but we could help you to think about what some of those other programs might be for specific projects as well.
Thank you.
And another thing to note is, I don't know if the town is starting to think yet about how you might handle the funds that are coming through the American Rescue Plan Act, but that's going to be a fairly substantial pool of money that is available for certain types of infrastructure projects. And so there's a sewer bucket under there, broadband, and water, and the sewer category also covers stormwater. So there's some opportunity potentially to fit some of these types of projects in with that money as well.
I think we haven't gotten too many details yet in terms of the specificity of how the funds can be used.
Yeah, I think all of that is still developing. The Mass Municipal Association has some pretty good resources. I don't know, I think they may not have been updated in the last month or so, but they're a good source to keep track of sort of how that's all developing and how exactly the money is going to be distributed. There's a local portion that goes directly to individual communities, and then I believe there's a second portion that's being distributed through the counties. So there's kind of two different ways that it's being channeled to towns. Any other questions or thoughts?
What is the next step? So now that we've completed the public session, what is the next step in terms of planning or, our responsibility for what we need to do to move this forward?
Mm-hmm. So we will be wrapping up this grant by next Wednesday, June 30th, the end of the fiscal year. And that means that we'll be incorporating any final comments that anyone from the town has submitted in terms of the priorities and the draft report. So we'll be finalizing that and submitting that as the final deliverable to the state. And then from there, I sort of alluded to the annual report process. So every year, MVP will be looking for a report that sort of updates your priorities and asks if the core team has reconvened to further discuss this. So it's a good idea to sort of start planning to have, don't need to be particularly frequent, but to have a couple of meetings on the books for the core team to get together and talk about exactly that. How do you start to advance these? How do you want to be preparing for the next round of action grants? Is there a project you want to be starting to think about and shape so that you're ready when that RFP comes out next spring. Those would be my key recommendations. You're about a year out from the next cycle, so you don't need to act real quickly on the grant front, but thinking about which projects you might want to pursue should really be your priority, so you can start to be looking at funding sources. And in terms of the FEMA funding, if that's something you want to check into, the most important thing there is to make sure that your hazard mitigation plan is up to date. And I apologize, I don't know off the top of my head what the expiration is on that. Does anybody know? I don't know, Ed, if you know what its status is, or is Dawn still on? But that you do have to have a current hazard mitigation plan to apply for the BRIC funding, and it's caught a lot of communities off guard that they're excited to apply for that, and then they realize that all of a sudden their plan is going to expire 6 months from now, and so they won't actually have a plan in action at the time that the applications are due and awarded, and so they then aren't eligible. So that's another thing just to check on, and we could actually pull that up and look right now at what your timeline is for when your plan is good. But those would be the sort of things I'd be thinking about.
It was updated in 2016.
Okay.
And Don is still on, so.
I'm here.
Isn't it a 5-year update though?
It is, yeah. And that's what a lot of communities are feeling like, oh, we just did this a couple of years ago. Right. Then it turns out that it's about to expire. So let me look up the date real quick.
We're due again. I'm pretty sure we're right on the cusp.
It sounds like it.
I just looked in my email and I found something from 2010 was the last time we were working on it. It doesn't seem like it could be that. It's got to be sooner than that.
Yeah, I know it is, because I know it was still good as of about a year ago. And at that point, I thought we had a couple years left on it.
Okay.
Yeah, the PVPC website said it was adopted on December 20th, 2016.
Oh, good. Good.
What were you referring to?
Sorry, it's the PVPC, the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, has it on their website.
But what document or what are you talking about? I missed what you were talking
Hazard
about.
mitigation.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah, the hazard mitigation plan.
Okay, all right, thanks.
And that's good for 5 years?
Yes, so I just looked it up. So yours expires January 30 of 2022, according to the state. So I think if you wanted to look at BRIC funding this year, I think you would maybe just sneak in.
Yeah, January is the deadline for the FEMA BRIC.
Yeah, it's right. January 29th is the BRIC deadline.
Right. Yep.
So you might be okay, but they would want when you receive the funding, they want you to also have a plan in place. So that would be the next step that I would say you want to look into getting that update underway, so that because it's not a short process, because there's a lot of as I'm sure you know, public meetings and steps that have to be undertaken as part of that, as well as the time that it takes to get approval by MEMA and FEMA so that the plan is fully approved. So that would be an important thing to have on your radar, because that does seem like it's going to be a really good funding source, and they're expecting to ramp up the amount of funds available through that program. And it's also, BRIC also looks at nature-based solutions and climate vulnerable populations and equity issues, but it's less of a focus. So other projects like generators are eligible under BRIC. Some of those harder infrastructure type solutions are still eligible under BRIC. So it has some more flexibility in that way. And so it's definitely a valuable program. Culverts can also be funded under BRIC. It really encompasses a lot of different types of projects.
I think just a note back on your page that talked about things that have been accomplished in town. You can actually mark, I believe, the master plan as having been updated.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Excellent.
Any other questions, comments? My addresses.
Does your role end with the submission of this at the end of June?
Officially, yes, but as I said, we're happy to keep chatting about potential projects, and we frequently work with communities to put together grants and help to sort of collaboratively develop projects that we think would be fundable under various programs and help you pursue them. So we're happy to stay in touch. We'd love to do that and continue the conversation.
Great.
Ed, is there anything else that you'd like to say in closing?
No, I'd just like to thank everyone for being involved in the process overall since its beginning, and also thank everyone for joining tonight and the listening session. And again, once again, everyone had very, thoughtful and insightful questions, and you had very good answers. So thank you all very much. And I know I will be in touch with you and Sarah over the next few days. So thank you for your help in this.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
If anyone has any comments, we're finalizing after tomorrow, so please send them to me. My email address is shayden@fando.com. I'd be happy to accept and incorporate any feedback into the report.
I'm working my way through it, but it's not exactly a page turner. No offense.
Yeah, no. Dense.
It's like one of those, Chapter 90 reports you give me.
I was going to say, it's like the emails I send you and the select board.
Yeah, the bridge reports we get from the state.
Ooh, the bridge reports. Those are really dry.
Yeah.
They sure are. Well, this has been very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Quite welcome.
Yeah, everyone have a good evening.
You too.
As well.
Thank you. You too.
Good night.
Night. Thanks for joining, everybody.